What is it like to come face to face with evil? To confront your worst nightmare? When a killer comes calling, there's often no escape.
A man who can kill is evil beyond belief.
To truly encounter evil is a rarity most will never experience.
I believe in evil, and I've experienced people that are evil.
But for those unfortunate few who do and survive to tell the tale, the mental scars often never heal.
I couldn't breathe. My eyes felt bulging. All I could see was his face on my face, and he was just staring into my eyes.
We meet the men and women whose lives have been forever altered by their brush with the beasts who live among us. This is Encounters with Evil. In this episode, Imprisoners.
They would feed them, they would film them, they would abuse them, they would kill them.
Individuals who kidnap, abuse, and enslave their victims.
There are various reasons why people abduct. Sometimes you get one parent abducting a child from another parent. You get children abducted to become sex slaves. And then you get people who are just abducting purely for financial reasons.
Coming up, American sexual sadist Ariel Castro, who kidnapped and imprisoned 3 young girls for nearly a decade.
She felt that a part of her heart died the moment that Castro closed the door behind her.
Austrian monster Josef Fritzl, who fathered 7 children with his own daughter in his underground dungeon.
She was, if you like, at his mercy. She would be chained up and raped where she was.
And the callous, armed robber and killer who imprisoned and murdered a 17-year-old girl for financial gain.
He's not planned his murders, he's not doing it for pleasure, he's gone out to get money.
But first, a kidnapping that was global front-page news. In March 1998, 10-year-old Natascha Kampusch disappeared whilst on her way to school in suburban Vienna, Austria.
There was a great deal of astonishment when Natascha disappeared. She just vanished into thin air.
Her family, the police, and the whole of Austria were baffled by her disappearance. Every line of inquiry seemed to be a dead end. As the years passed by, Natascha's whereabouts remained a mystery. Who was responsible for her disappearance?
This man is capable of unspeakable inhumanity to victims, and I think that's what people find so disconcerting about the Pricklepill case.
Wolfgang Pricklopill was a resident of Strasshof, a quiet suburban town just outside of Vienna.
Pricklepill was a very unobtrusive young man. There was nothing outstanding, there was nothing about him that said this man is going to be a monster.
His house in Strasshof had been built during the Cold War and included a bomb shelter. Pricklopill had modified and isolated this cellar to create a secret chamber.
Building a secure, safe and hidden underground complex within his own home took a lot of planning and a lot of hard work. Some have suggested that he must have been fantasizing about this from a relatively early age. I think there's no doubt that that complex was built with the view to holding an individual against their will and in secrecy.
On the morning of the 2nd of March 1998, 10-year-old Natascha Maria Kampusch began her walk to school in the Donaustadt district of Vienna.
She was heading towards school. She did spot a white van with a man standing next to it. This possibly just kind of triggered something at the back of her mind, but not enough suspicion to prevent her from carrying on and walking past.
The man ahead was predator Pricklepill, on the prowl.
On the day of the abduction, I'm sure that his adrenaline would have been racing incredibly. I think he would have been aroused, possibly sexually, but certainly psychologically. This was an unassuming man who you wouldn't look twice at in the street, and he was about to commit one of the most audacious crimes Austria would have heard of.
Pricklepill seized the opportunity and grabbed Natascha, bundling her into his van, wrapping her in a rug.
As a 10-year-old, Natascha will have been aware of the fact that people are abducted and that they do die as a consequence. This would have instilled a great amount of fear.
Pricklepill immediately drove back to his house, number 60 Heinestrasse in Strasshof, and carried Natascha down into the secret chamber.
Natascha then found herself in basically a cell. Very damp, very, very kind of smelly area. In darkness, with no ventilation. This would have felt like as if it was the end for her.
Natascha was now completely cut off from the outside world, prey to Pricklepill's sordid desires.
I've got no doubt that there would have been some sexual motivation in what he was doing. Even if that doesn't necessarily involve the sexual abuse of the victim, having an individual who he controlled and now owned, whose life depended on him, that in itself could have been a sexual release for him. The power that he had over somebody else's life or death.
He wanted someone who was going to be pure. It was a fantasy. It had to be perfect. So he wanted to groom her from an early age, and she was going to be his perfect bride.
But Natascha was incredibly strong-willed.
She was a very resilient and tough little girl. She fought against everything. She wasn't willing to play along with this new regime. As time went on, and as she wasn't rescued, then clearly she had to comply with his regime. Eat when she was told, go to sleep when she was told.
Ich habe in meiner Gefangenschaft auch sehr oft gehungert und habe dadurch auch miterlebt, was man da alles hat. Kreislaufbeschwerden, Konzentrationsschwierigkeiten.
As the weeks and months passed, Natascha was subjected to all manner of torture, including humiliation, beatings, and sexual abuse.
He did rape her. He did engage in sexual contact.
Resistance takes energy. It is an easier life if you do as you're told and you comply with the regime as a captive.
After 6 years in captivity, Pricklepill finally allowed Natascha to come out of his dungeon.
He slowly but surely introduces some kind of generosity and slight freedoms for her, to the point where she could actually go out with him into public.
He was so confident that he was right that he knew she wouldn't attempt to make a break and that she wouldn't let anybody know what had happened to her. And this proved right up to a point.
Pricklepill seemed in some way to be attempting to live out the fantasy of a normal life with Natascha.
Pricklepill had a romantic notion that this could end in marriage, this could end in children, this could end in the normal relationship that he'd been deprived of throughout his adult life.
But while Pricklepill was consumed by his fantasy, 16-year-old Natascha's confidence was growing, and she was looking for the perfect opportunity to escape.
When did he not pay attention? When was he at his most vulnerable? When was he not having his mind on the job? And I think she was able to use this knowledge she was acquiring day by day to see when her best opportunity of escape would be.
On the 23rd of August 2006, Pricklepill had ordered Natascha to vacuum the interior of his van as it was parked in the driveway. Pricklepill's mobile phone rang, and Natascha saw her opportunity.
She saw that circumstance where Pricklepill was on his phone, the vacuum was making too much noise, he backed off, and crucially, she saw that the gate was open, and she ran as fast as she could.
She made it to another house nearby and called the police. After 3,096 days as Pricklepill's prisoner, Natascha Kampusch was finally free.
When Natascha finally escaped, the world was almost taken by surprise because this story had died many years before. And all of a sudden, it's back on the front pages. The media went absolutely crazy over this entire issue.
Having lost his captive, for Pricklepill, there was only one option.
Pricklepill's method was particularly visceral in that he laid down on train tracks and deliberately was beheaded by an express train.
He did not want to be caught, he did not want to be vilified. In keeping with the kind of schizoid character, his lack of feelings and social sense for others also applied to himself.
However, Natascha recognized that her captor had also suffered.
Beide Eltern haben mir immer wieder glaubhaft versichern können, dass sie mich lieben. Und er hatte sowas nicht. Ihm fehlte in gewisser Weise so etwas wie Selbstsicherheit und sowas. Diese Geborgenheit, das hat ihm gefehlt.
In 1975, police were engaged in a manhunt for a dangerous suspect known as the Black Panther. Wanted for armed robbery, murder, and the kidnap of 17-year-old Lesley Whittle, this master criminal had become public enemy number one.
He didn't actively seek out to be violent, but when he was confronted, he was willing to use violence.
But who was the Black Panther? Born in 1936 in Bradford, Donald Neilson married at 18 and, after a spell in the army, became a builder to support his wife and daughter. He found it difficult to make ends meet and so turned to crime as a burglar.
He tapped into the average person's fear. He broke in the middle of the night, initially to houses, which everybody fears somebody breaking into their house when you're sleeping.
But burgling houses wasn't profitable enough for Neilson, so he chose to up the ante and rob small post offices.
In those days, we had very low security, so they were quite easy to turn over.
He carried out these robberies armed.
He's being an ex-soldier, used to carrying guns, and I suspect that he was quite happy to use that gun.
But his real weapon of choice was stealth.
He would attempt to sneak in and out of the post offices without being seen. And part of that was that he wore black clothes and a black balaclava.
The best thing is to get in and out without any contact at all. And if you're really professional, you do it in a very, very short time. He would have looked at the building, looked at how to take the alarm out, how to get in and out as quickly as possible.
Neilson's career as an armed robber was successful until February 1974, when a post office master in Harrogate confronted him.
Most people, when faced with a shotgun, do as they're told. But on the other hand, these are sub-postmasters running their own business. It's their money that's being stolen. They're more likely to put up some resistance, and that's when he shoots them.
Neilson shot dead sub-postmaster Donald Skepper.
The police are now looking for somebody for murder. He knew that he was a wanted man now.
But this didn't deter him. Neilson's reign of terror wasn't over. He continued raiding post offices and committed 2 more murders.
The second murder was witnessed by the wife of the postmaster, and she gave a witness account of him dressed all in black, but she described him almost panther-like. And the journalist who was interviewing her then coined that term, the Black Panther, and that stuck with him.
By 1975, the hunt was on for the brutal killer known as the Black Panther. Neilson had already stolen around £45,000, but he still wanted more.
He's not planned his murders, he's not doing it for pleasure, he's gone out to get money.
And from his modest Bradford home, the Black Panther was plotting his biggest score yet.
He reads in the newspapers that a man has died and he's left a large amount of money to his children.
The inheritance was £250,000.
He thinks, well, I can easily get £50,000 of that money, and all I need to do is to plan a kidnapping of one of the children.
17-year-old Lesley Whittle looked like an easy target.
At that time, 50,000 quid would be worth about £300,000 today, so it's quite a large amount of money.
On the 14th of January 1975, Neilson breaks into the Whittle family home in the Shropshire village of Highley. He creeps up to Lesley Whittle's bedroom and snatches her, leaving a ransom note demanding £50,000. Neilson drives Lesley to a remote spot in Kidsgrove and imprisons her in a network of underground tunnels. He tethers her by the neck with steel cable to a platform in a vertical drainage shaft.
He kept her there while he was negotiating the ransom. That's unusual. You wouldn't expect to find somebody hidden in a drain system. The facilities must have been really drastic for her. There'd be nowhere for her to eat, to wash, or to use the toilet or anything. So very barbaric. He's not bothered about her. She's just a means to an end.
Neilson instructs the Whittles to take a call at a random phone box, where he plans to play a recording of Lesley.
There's no need to worry, Mum, I'm okay. I've got a bit wet, but I'm quite dry now. I'm being treated very well.
The police botch the moment, and the call goes unanswered. Neilson makes contact again, but his instructions and directions are unclear.
Go on to the M6 North to junction 10 and on to the A454.
The ransom drop seems doomed to fail.
By the time I'd collected the money, and then I got lost on the way to Kidsgrove because I'd never been there before, and then I had difficulty in finding the instructions in the phone box, and in consequence there was quite a considerable delay.
In a desperate last-ditch attempt to save his sister, Ronald Whittle even appears on television, assuring Neilson that he intended to pay the ransom.
Well, I would hope that he would get in touch with me. We've had so many calls, some of which are very clearly hoaxes. As you can see yourself, the money is here. He's got various means of communication available to him.
I will do whatever is reasonable to get Lesley back. That is the important thing as far as we're concerned.
Tragically, the Black Panther lost his nerve, and after a week there was no more contact with the Whittles.
The police are left at a complete loss. There's been mistake after mistake made, and they have no idea who the Black Panther is. Lesley's still missing.
To be fair to the police forces involved, the instructions that Neilson had left for them were quite cryptic, and he was clearly playing games with them. But it was up to the police to piece together the vague clues that he'd left around. I think that willingness for the police to stumble for another 7 weeks until they found her exact location shows us that Neilson had no intention for her to be found alive at all.
He's thought it was going to be a very simple in and out, take the girl, get the money and go, and then it's all dragging on. Now, if you're paranoid, you start becoming more and more anxious about what's happening, you start to misinterpret what's happening. Are the police going to track me down? Am I going to be found?
On Friday, the 7th of March 1975, police finally investigate the drainage shaft that had been Lesley Whittle's prison. Tragically, Lesley's body is found hanging from the steel cable that Neilson had secured around her neck.
This is a terrible and shocking crime. The circumstances of this girl's death, the agony she must have gone through, contemplating what might happen, does not bear description. Everybody should do their utmost to bring this to a close.
With the death of Lesley Whittle on his hands, the Black Panther had gone to ground. The police still had no clues as to his identity. It took another 9 months before the Panther was finally apprehended in December that year. Police officers Tony White and Stuart Mackenzie catch a lucky break after questioning a man they think looks suspicious.
Whilst my colleague was asking the questions, I was writing the answers down. And as I got to the more or less the last question, suddenly a voice says, "Don't move, any tricks and you're dead." At this point I glanced to my left and was looking down the business end of a double-barreled sawn-off shotgun. And the next thing I felt was this gun pushed into my ribs underneath my armpit. And on getting himself comfortable, he says, "Right, drive."
While driving, Officer Mackenzie distracted the armed assailant and carried out a daring maneuver. Pushing up the gun and hitting the brakes, Neilson was thrown from the car and, with the help of passers-by, arrested. On investigation, Neilson's fingerprints were a match to those found in the drain shaft, where Lesley Whittle had been imprisoned. Although he admitted to the kidnapping, Neilson was adamant that he hadn't murdered Lesley.
But he always denied ever killing Lesley, and he's justified his behaviour saying he looked after her, he watered her, fed her, made sure she was safe while he spent 3 days negotiating the ransom.
He claimed that she must have fallen accidentally.
The question of whether she jumped, fell, whether he killed her or not, we will never know.
Neilson was found guilty of Lesley's murder, as well as those of the postmasters.
He is willing and able to use violence because he wants money, and he is driven so purely by money that he's very cold. He's willing to kidnap a young girl, to keep her in horrific conditions for weeks on end because he wants the monetary reward. And that is incredibly calculating.
Neilson died aged 75 in 2011, still in jail.
How evil, how ruthless, how terribly wicked this man is that we've hunted for 7 weeks. God above, I never dreamt in my wildest dreams he'd do such a thing to a girl. It's terrible.
April 2008. Austrian police interview Elizabeth Fritzel, who's been missing for 24 years. She reveals to the shocked officers she'd been held prisoner by her father and used as a sex slave in a secret underground dungeon.
This was the kind of ultimate incestuous abuse of one's own daughter, protracted over many, many years.
Josef Fritzl, it seems, was programmed from a young age to become deviant in his behavior. Growing up during the Nazi era, he had a warped maternal relationship.
Fritzl's background was far from normal. His mother was very vicious with him. She had almost a hatred of him. He developed very bizarre sexual feelings towards his mother, and the combination meant that his actual developmental psychological state was somewhat disturbed.
Where a child has an absent father and they are beaten on a daily basis by their mother, as Fritzel alleges, then you have a perfect recipe for a sadomasochistic, misogynistic control freak. I believe that Fritzel suffered as a child, and as an adult, what he wanted to do was be in the position of being the person who meted out the punishment.
By 1967, in his early 30s, Fritzel is married with 4 young children. He's also convicted of raping a 24-year-old woman at knife point.
Josef Fritzl needed to humiliate women. He was convicted of a rape very early on. And I know that usually for every sexual offence that we know about, there are many more that we don't know about.
Despite serving an 18-month sentence for the rape, his marriage and family remained intact. And Fritzel went on to father 3 more children. But it was his 4th child, Elizabeth, that he was obsessed by.
He was quite brutal to her in her early years. He then kind of like changed his attitude to some degree. He felt they had a connection. But he then tried to groom her by exposing himself to her on occasion, leaving porn underneath her pillow. But eventually this culminated in him actually assaulting her and beginning to sexually abuse her from the age of 11.
In 1978, Fritzel started work on an extension to his house that included a large cellar. His plans to imprison his daughter had begun to take shape.
And that took a period of years. So it was in his mind, and it was certainly part of his fantasy life for years.
This hidden area where he could restrain someone for sexual purposes. The elements of this, I think, arrived first when he was in prison, and when he got the opportunity, he did it, and he did it with detailed planning.
By the summer of 1983, Fritzel had completed his dungeon, a living space equipped with a toilet, shower, sleeping quarters, and chains, all concealed behind a series of locking doors. As her 18th birthday approached, Elizabeth planned to move out of the family home for good to escape the abuse.
Fritzel was very worried in case Elizabeth ran away at this point where he had this massive plan of being able to incarcerate her. But as it came to the day and Elizabeth was still there, he was cold, dispassionate. He had it planned down to the finest detail.
On the 28th of April 1984, Josef Fritzl asked Elizabeth to help him with a job in his new cellar.
Fritzel lured Elizabeth into the dungeon in order to actually fit a door. Of course, once she was there, he attacked her, he chloroformed her, and the next thing she knew, she was captive.
I think that finding herself in prison, she must have been extremely panicked. She must have feared for her life. I think that she then must have gone through a process of feeling desolated, feeling despair, and probably wanting to die. And then what sets in is a feeling of learned helplessness. You simply learn not to hope for anything better. This is your lot.
But how did Fritzl plan to account for the disappearance of his daughter?
Fritzl covered up Elizabeth's disappearance with the basic story that she had gone off and joined a cult somewhere. As evidence of this, he forced Elizabeth to write a letter, but he went to the extent of posting it from a fairly distant postbox, driving hundreds of miles in order to give it credibility when it finally arrived on the doormat. Strangely enough, more or less everyone, including Fritzl's wife, actually bought this story.
With Elizabeth locked away in his purpose-built dungeon, Fritzl had total control over her life.
She was, if you like, at his mercy. Initially, she would be chained up and raped where she was. He would rape her 3,000 times over this period. He would enact pornographic positions with her. He knew no bounds. She was an object, like all women to him, just someone to be used.
He wanted to have total possession over another person. The fact that he was able to do this to his own children, I would say that it's about as psychologically evil as it is possible to get.
Throughout her imprisonment, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children.
She was left to give birth herself. She was thrown a towel and a knife and left to get on with it. And that baby was brought into a world that was a smelly, unhygienic, damp dungeon.
One of the children, a twin, died soon after birth. Fritzel incinerated the body. It soon became clear the dungeon wasn't big enough for all of the children.
It was a puzzle that could only really be solved by taking the children out of the cellar and moving them upstairs. And he found an incredibly plausible way of doing this.
Fritzel claimed that he found the babies on his doorstep, along with a letter from Elizabeth asking the family to look after them.
For us, it would seem laughable that people would accept that, these children arrived on the doorstep. However, this blended so well with Fritzel's story that Elizabeth was with some cult and that may have been under strictures and couldn't cope with the children. It convinced the social services, it convinced more or less everybody.
In 2008, everything was to change. Elizabeth's oldest child, Kirsten, was seriously ill.
At this point, Elizabeth begged him to allow Kirsten to go to hospital, because this could have been a life and death situation.
Fritzel reluctantly agreed to take the child, but at the hospital, there was a problem.
The hospital required further information. They needed to know aspects from the mother. Elizabeth then persuaded Fritzel to let her go to the hospital and clarify the situation, and of course assured him that there would be no risk.
Josef Fritzl was undone by a solitary, single act of mercy when he took his 19-year-old granddaughter Kirsten, unconscious, out of the cellar and to hospital. From that moment, everything unraveled.
His perverted world is about to come crashing down.
Let's not forget that this was Elizabeth's first time out of the basement in quarter of a century. So she must have been absolutely overwhelmed. She has been under Fritzl's total control for 24 years. I think that what would have been paramount in her mind is, what if I'm not believed? And then I'm returned to my father. What would the consequences of that been? I mean, they could have been fatal to her. So she didn't say anything until the police convinced her, and she took a lot of convincing, that in actual fact she was safe and she would never have to lay eyes on Josef Fritzl again.
Elizabeth explained to the police the events of her imprisonment and the depths of her father's cruelty. Finally, she and her children were set free. Josef Fritzl's trial began on the 16th of March 2009 and lasted only 4 days. He was charged with rape, enslavement, false imprisonment, incest, coercion, and negligent homicide. He was found guilty on all counts. Josef Fritzl will never be released from prison. Today, the Fritzel family are trying to rebuild their lives and find some sort of normality.
Getting out of the basement isn't the end of the ordeal by any stretch. I think that the biggest challenge for them would be an unlearning of everything that they knew. They are the product of essentially incest and torture. How do you even begin to start making sense of that?
He did not have the wherewithal to be sensitive to their needs or feelings. Fritzl, he was someone who gained a great deal of pleasure from inflicting harm on others.
On the 6th of May 2013, a young woman called out for help from the locked front door of an ordinary house in Cleveland, Ohio.
What's going on there? I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here, I'm free now. I'm Amanda Berry. I've been on the news for the last 10 years.
And you said, what was his name again?
Ariel Castro.
She kept saying, I'm something Berry, I've been missing, call 911, call 911, and she was adamant, she was hysterical. This was not a joke. You could look at this girl and tell that this was the real deal.
With the help of passers-by and the police, 3 girls who'd all been missing for almost a decade were rescued from what they described as a living hell. The man responsible for their ordeal was Ariel Castro, now considered one of America's most notorious imprisoners.
Castro wanted a solution to his urges which he knew were actually completely aberrant, completely unacceptable.
My addiction to pornography and my sexual problem has really taken a toll on my mind.
He was very readily able to make people's lives horrific, a living hell, and for those reasons we probably would label him as some kind of psychopath.
There's something that has caused him to become a sexual sadist. He says that he was raped as a child, and maybe that's where it started, maybe that's the seeds of his perversion.
His criminal career as a sexual imprisoner began in August 2002, when Castro persuaded 21-year-old Michelle Knight to get into his van on the promise of a free puppy.
His first victim was actually the perfect choice for him. I don't think it was calculated on his part, but he happened to choose Michelle Knight, who had a history of running away, who was a bit of a wild child.
Castro took her to his home at 2207 Seymour and locked her in his basement.
Her family didn't look for her, and that must have given him a sense of, this is possible for me. This fantasy is possible, and I'm getting away with it.
Castro began to inflict systematic sexual abuse on Michelle.
All sexual predators are addicts on some level. What they have is never enough. It's never enough just to fantasize, they have to act on it. When they act on it, they have to act on it again.
8 months later, that is exactly what happened. On April the 23rd, 2003, Castro struck again. It was the day before Amanda Berry's 17th birthday, when she accepted a lift home from Castro, who claimed his son worked with her.
He wouldn't have been able to meet his needs with just one woman, because eventually it would become boring, it would become commonplace. He would need to add some interest, because fantasies always refine, they always change and they always evolve. So he was going to continue to do whatever he could get away with in order to meet this need.
This sexual sadist now had 2 girls to abuse at will, but this was still not enough for Castro.
They were all enduring a pretty horrific and disgusting existence at his hands.
A year later, on the 2nd of April 2004, Castro kidnapped a 3rd victim. This time, the girl was even younger. 14-year-old Gina De Jesus joined Michelle and Amanda in Castro's sadistic sex cell.
I can only imagine the absolute despondency that these girls went through. And that, of course, was probably part of the excitement to Castro, because he's a sadist, so he would have observed this and he would have felt gratified by this.
Castro's brutality knew no bounds. Apart from the rape and the violence, he would starve the girls to control them.
What you have is an extended period of, well, utter hell. It's a living death, if you like.
Their life was a daily hell of uncertainty, of not knowing if it would be beatings, if it would be rape, if it would be sexual assault. They were only allowed to shower maybe twice a week if they were lucky. They were fed 1 meal a day. Their treatment was pretty barbaric.
He can't meet his urges through any even semblance of a normal relationship. And so the solution for him was to have sex slaves, captives, and they met his sexual needs also.
Castro's rapes of his victims were incessant.
As a result, Michelle Knight became pregnant several times.
His way of dealing with this was to terminate the pregnancy by beatings and by hitting her and throwing her around the room.
Castro also impregnated Amanda Berry, but decided to keep the baby.
I don't think he viewed Michelle as a particularly decent or worthwhile person, but I think he felt more kindly towards his second and third, the younger victims, and saw Amanda as someone who was worthwhile to have his child.
Amanda gave birth to a baby girl in 2006 without any professional medical care.
He was an individual who was capable of killing his own unborn children, but also, at the same time, able to facilitate the birth of one of his children. So this was an individual who was able to nurture and kill at the same time.
A complex individual. While Castro was incredibly cruel to his captives, to the outside world, he seemed like an ordinary man.
No one really disliked him because he was just terrific.
He was a good guy, friendly, good guy. We never thought that he was doing this.
If this is a person who can easily lock other human beings in a room and compartmentalize them away from the real world, then he can easily compartmentalize different parts of his personality away from the real world. But there are some very chilling and cruel aspects to his outside appearance. For instance, he tried to get closer to the family of one of his victims, trying to help them in the hunt for their daughter. In fact, he did take part in the manhunt for her in the initial stages after her disappearance.
Ariel Castro had been involved with the search parties. He passed out flyers. He was right there with us the first day that Gina was missing.
He was enjoying being the only person who knew what really happened to their daughter whilst looking the parents in the eye, and that shows a particular type of psychopathology and cruelty.
To prevent the girls from trying to escape, Castro employed savage behavioral control techniques.
So what he did was he gave the girls opportunities to sometimes near escape, to open a door, for example. And sometimes he would allow that to happen, and then other times brutally beat them. What that left them with was an uncertainty that kept them psychologically trapped in that room. He did shackle them to walls, but the physical restraints actually became slightly less as time went on because the mental restraints had been put in place.
Castro was so confident of his control over his captives, he even took them into his garden.
My granddaughter was upstairs one day and they saw a girl back there crawling naked in the backyard.
They saw women being walked as dogs.
And then the guy took all these boards and like sectioned off the backyard so nobody can see into there.
Finally, after almost a decade in captivity, Amanda saw an opportunity and found the courage to act on it.
I hear the screaming. So I see one of my neighbors across the street leave his house. This girl is kicking the door and screaming. So I go over there and I say, well, can I help you? What's going on? She says, I've been kidnapped and I've been in this house a long time. I want to leave right now. All right, so I opened the door and we couldn't get in that way. So we kicked the bottom of it and she came through. And when she came, I thought she was the only one. And she grabbed some little girl and had the little girl in her arms. She said, this is his daughter.
What's going on there?
I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years and I'm here, I'm free now. I'm Amanda Berry.
Ariel Castro was arrested the next day. He pled guilty on the 26th of July 2013 to over 900 counts of rape and sexual abuse. But Castro was in denial of his actions, refusing to accept full responsibility.
Most of the sex that went on in the house, and probably all of it, was consensual. People were trying to paint me as a monster, and I'm not a monster. I'm sick.
He received life plus 1,000 years on the 8th of May 2013. On his conviction, Michelle Knight read out a statement to her abductor.
Ariel Castro, you took 11 years of my life away, and I have got it back. I spent 11 years in hell. Now your hell is just beginning.
After just 1 month serving his sentence, Castro committed suicide. on the 3rd of September 2013.
I don't think he had any end game in mind, and I think that he would have carried on until something tragic happened, until he lost one of these women and had to dispose of a body.
I think to consider what Castro did to those women, to those girls, is possibly as close to evil as one could be.